in order to put some things into practice with a front-end framework, we're going to switch back now to working in Atom directly. Now, we used CodePen for the last section because it's a nice convenient way to be able to compile SAS really quickly. And in fact, you can also do Bootstrap instead of CodePen. But when we write things inside of CodePen, it does a lot of the work for us. We aren't going to be taking SAS forward or working with it later in this class, but we will be taking Bootstrap forward and working with it continuously. So make sure that you now work back inside of Atom so that you know how to use this on subsequent lessons that we'll be working with. For now, I have set up some basic files to be able to show another example here. I've got an HTML file called example9 that's empty, a CSS file called example9.css that's empty, and then I have this file. This is a table that I've generated that contains names, phone numbers, and emails for 50 people. I just generated this online using some random generation tools. You can Google around for things that do this. And then I formatted it all into a table using Microsoft Excel to help me do it fairly quickly. So we've got this over here in a nice HTML table format. I haven't even tried to render this yet, so we'll see what we get when we get to that point. For now, let's start with the HTML. The first thing that we need to see is how we set up the page to include something like Bootstrap as our underlying front-end framework. Now, luckily, we've already got a package installed in Atom that makes this really easy. You can start to type HTML, and you'll have seen this before. Of course, we've got our boilerplate snippet that you've already seen before that we created ourselves way back in an earlier lesson. But there's some other ones that were installed by a Bootstrap library that we put in there. We've got a basic HTML template, which is much smaller, a larger HTML template that's used for creating a sort of fully ready-to-go Bootstrap page, and then a minimal one. The minimal one is my personal favorite, so I'm going to select that. Now, this pulls in a lot of things that you might not want moving forward, but it's the quickest way to get a sort of basic framework for a Bootstrap web page. You might want to whittle this down a little bit into something that's a little more straightforward. To do that, let's talk about what we're seeing here. First of all, it starts out like we'd expect any HTML page to. It's got the doc type declaration, and then it has the HTML tag with the lang equals end in it. Then we've got the head. Inside the head, we actually have 3 tags that are used in order to ensure this looks consistent across different devices. These are some little hacks and tweaks for different browsers, like you'll notice Edge here has a special tweak that it has, and that are used for phone devices in order to make sure that the scale remains consistent on the phone, regardless of whether it's a high DPI phone or a regular DPI phone. While these things are certainly more advanced, you do not need to keep them in there for the purposes of this class. It's still not a bad idea to follow some practices where these sorts of things are included. Just be consistent about it. I'm going to leave them in there for now. Then of course we have title. I'm going to go ahead and just call this Bootstrap example. Next we have 2 very important lines. This is where we actually link in the guts of Bootstrap. Bootstrap, as I mentioned before, is written in a style language, these days mostly SAS, though it does come in a less form as well. Moving forward, when they move to Bootstrap 4, it will be exclusively done in SAS. Here, it pulls in the main Bootstrap CSS file. But where the heck is this coming from? Well, it's actually coming from a server out on the internet, something that's called a Content Delivery Network, or CDN. This one's called MaxCDN. It's a very common one for people to use. Bootstrap has licensed with them to use them as their preferred content delivery network. And by forming this URL, following the rules that you want to, it's going to go out and grab the exact version of Bootstrap that matches the one you list here. And this one's actually, in fact, a little bit out of date. We could up this number a little bit. This just happens to be the one that it picks when you use the basic one that's in here. It also pulls in something else called Font Awesome. It's a lovely name. Font Awesome is included inside of Bootstrap and is something that gives you the ability to do all sorts of little icons and other things without having to actually draw them graphically. They're just loaded as different glyphs inside of fonts. So Font Awesome is a very useful thing to include along with Bootstrap. You don't have to include it, but I want you to in this class because we might actually dabble into some of these icons that are included with this. And we might as well leave it in there since it's part of the snippet that we're using. Here now we have two little inclusions that are there just to make Bootstrap work a little bit better with Internet Explorer 9, Internet Explorer before version 9. So this is a directive inside of a comment, and this is a directive that will get parsed by Internet Explorer. It will see this and then say, if less than Internet Explorer 9, go ahead and load these two as well. And those are actually little, they call them shivs, or sometimes they're called, forgetting the term here, something that fills in all, a polyfill. Sometimes they're called polyfills that add functionality that wasn't there in an older browser, but is commonplace in newer browsers. Again, these aren't terribly important for the purposes of our class, but it's still good to know that they exist. Might as well leave them in there. As we get on down, finally we get to the body. And here in the body is where we can put in our own stuff, anything we'd really like to. And here's where we'll start adding our content. But of course the file's not done. There's two more things that it's loading in. These are JavaScript files. And like I've shown before, they're typically included at the bottom of the body so that they are parsed after the file has fully been constructed. The first one is not Bootstrap. This is actually jQuery. We're going to be learning all about jQuery. jQuery is a library of really useful JavaScript functions that are meant to be used on the web. And we'll learn all about how to work with this in Unit 2. Bootstrap uses jQuery, so it requires you to include that first. These script tags will be executed in order, and Bootstrap has its own JavaScript that it uses. As I mentioned before, not everything can be done with just CSS, so it also includes some JavaScript to achieve its purposes. When you load bootstrap.min.js, it expects jQuery to be loaded, so make sure you leave them in this order. jQuery first, and then Bootstrap. So our basic file boilerplate has now gotten quite a bit more complicated, but we still know where our essential content is going to go. It's right here inside the body. So this is how we'll get set up to do this every time. Now you might want to pare this down a little bit to something that's a little more understandable for you. Maybe you want to upgrade these version numbers to something newer. Remember, you can always do that by making your own snippet. A few things to keep in mind. Whenever you are linking something in from another website, i.e. not from your server, make sure you include the full URL in it. It's also a really good idea to make sure you include the protocol on the front. If you don't include the protocol, it defaults to whatever was used to load the current page. And this gets really tricky when you do or don't have that S on the front of it. Sometimes the content you're loading is not secure, it's just HTTP. And then it can't load other things that have the S on it because it's going to default to HTTP. The same thing might happen vice versa. Maybe the files that are being served from the other website are not secure and don't support the S, but you load your file with the S. In order to avoid all that shenanigans, just make sure you explicitly put the protocol on the front of these. This is always the best practice when you're working with files from external servers, which these certainly are. So you see we have the MaxCDN server, we have Google's own server, and then MaxCDN again down here. Now, this doesn't have any content in it yet. We want to build up a little bit before we get to that. So first, let's add our usual bits and pieces. We always have a header, so we'll put the header in here. And we usually put an H1 inside of that. And we like to say something that describes the page that will actually be visible, because remember, typically the title is not visible to the user. So we'll say playing with Bootstrap as our main header here. And then we'll give ourselves a section as well. And we'll say something to the effect of, hello, what am I saying here? First, let's give it a H3 will do rather than H2, just so there's some differences between these two. And say something like, Bootstrap is fun. And then finish things off with a footer. Now notice, I'm putting all of this above those script tags. I want to make sure the script tags stay at the bottom no matter what. For the footer, we'll do our usual sort of stuff. I'm totally messing this up. There we go. We'll say made for CS248 at UW Stout and copy 2017 Seth Barrier, aka me. There we go. And let's trim this up a little bit here too. So there we go. Now we've got our basic sort of structure of all of this. One thing I'm going to do here, just for the sake of seeing before and after, I'm going to take out these style sheets. I can just highlight them and hit either Control or Command / and it will comment them out. I'm going to do the same thing to the JavaScript down here. The point being, I want to see what this page looks like before we bring in Bootstrap. And you'll notice Bootstrap does things to it even before we start using its pre-built libraries. All right, let's go ahead and open this. I'm going to do the Control-Shift-Q so it opens in a browser, and here we are. I want you to pay attention right now to what we're seeing here. If you haven't really worked with fonts very much or thought about them, this particular font that we're seeing right here is important to note as it is a serifed font. That means it has all these little tails on the end of everything that give it a little bit more of a stylish look. And there's something, font design goes into a lot of details about why you might or might not want to do this. There are also such things as sans serif fonts, meaning fonts that do not have those serifs in them. And those have their own sort of design qualities as well. Now, let's go ahead and turn on Bootstrap. I'll highlight these again and just hit Command / or Control / again to uncomment. It will just toggle the comments off. And it's just these two chunks that I want to uncomment. Don't worry about this one in here. That's something different. We'll leave that commented. And now we refresh. And instantly our page has changed. We have moved to the default font that is used by Bootstrap, which is a sans serif font. It also changed the size of our headers so that they're a little bit different from what we're normally used to. It also changed the spacing. Notice that we're much closer over to the edge right now, and there's a good reason for that. It's because we haven't actually used it correctly. So, right out of the gate, when you include Bootstrap, it instantly starts to change the style, the look and feel of your web page, even if you aren't using any of the Bootstrap classes yet. So keep that in mind. This is the default styling that Bootstrap applies. Now, one of the first things that Bootstrap wants you to do, it needs you to structure and nest your page inside of its own different bits and pieces that will add up to a larger thing that it can control. We're going to do this by adding div tags. And so remember, div tags are tags that have default to a block display style, but that themselves do not render anything in particular. You have to put content inside them for them to be something. I'm going to take everything that we did here, the header, the section, and the footer, and put them all inside a div tag. Like this. I do this not so that I get the whole display block thing that comes with it, but so that I can put them all inside of a particular class of objects. So class itself, I would normally have to go set up a class in my style sheet to use it, but as I've mentioned before, Bootstrap predefines a bunch of classes for you to use. If you're going to use anything that is a Bootstrap type class or any content on a web page, it first wants you to put it inside of something called container. Container is the basic sort of element that provides responsive design to Bootstrap. Everything on your page needs to be in some kind of container, and you can have more than one container if you'd like. Most of the time I'll stick with one just to keep things simple. So now all I've done is taken my basic web page and put it inside a single div with the class container. This means I put a custom element around this from Bootstrap that is the container element, and it will have a bunch of styles applied to it. Let's go ahead and refresh again. Now all of a sudden it's spacing it out. What's it really doing? Well, now it's starting to apply responsive design to this. I'm going to go ahead and go into Inspect here so that I can be in my developer tools. And let's get back out of this and go to the full sort of responsive interface. And so you'll notice here when you give it full width, it leaves it, let me make this a little wider so you can appreciate how this works. When I give it full width, it just sort of dynamically makes it bigger or smaller to fit the device. You'll also notice up at the top that it's generally snapping it to the size of a particular window as we're going along. Once we get small enough, it will start to move fluidly down. And as I start to bunch up on it so much that it doesn't fit anymore, it will eventually start shrinking, as you see. This is a lot like what we had before when we were looking at Bootstrap's own web page, right? And then as soon as we get up to this tablet size, it starts locking it to certain sizes. It no longer moves fluidly. It now locks to that size when you reach it. So this is the basics of responsive design, allowing it to resize itself to the content that it's inside of. And that requires you to put everything inside of the container class. Now you may have noticed here, as I was typing the word container, it offered me two options. We have a package loaded that added a whole bunch of suggestions that are related to Bootstrap. And so when you're typing inside a class container, it's going to show you the suggested Bootstrap classes that are offered to you. The basic container was what we just saw, but there's another one called Container Fluid. Let's do that one instead. This is an alternative to container, and you can probably guess what it does. Let's refresh here. Container Fluid still keeps things responsive, but it doesn't lock to those predefined sizes like we saw container do. This is not as recommended because this means that you really would have to design your page with every single possible in-between resolution that could happen, instead of designing it with a few of these locked basic resolutions in mind. So certainly Bootstrap wants you to use their regular container most of the time, but Container Fluid is available in case you want to have that full fluidity and not have it lock into certain sizes. Let's go back to container, since that's the more commonly used one. Now here I have this element that's marked as a header, and I've told the HTML layout engine that I want the content in here to be treated as a page header. But it doesn't render it any differently. Remember, when we had these sections in the footer and the header, it didn't actually do anything to them. And Bootstrap doesn't change that. It still doesn't really treat the header any differently. But it does have a class that we can apply that would treat it differently. We can apply page header to this element. And that says that this element and everything inside it should be rendered as if it was a header at the top of a page. Bootstrap will now do things slightly differently. It puts some additional spacing around it, and you'll notice here it puts that horizontal bar in there, which I've always liked, but now I don't have to put it in manually. It really treats it like a header that's up at the top of a page. So this is one of the first really simple ones that we can add into our code that gives us something more interesting to work with. Let's keep going here. I could also then, let's come into our section here where I'm doing Bootstrap is fun, which just shows up as a title. That's perfectly fine. I don't necessarily want to change anything about that. But now I'm ready to pull in something a little more involved. Let's grab our table. So again, you should be able to find this on the course website. I'm going to just drop this in inside of section, but below the Bootstrap is fun heading that I already had in there. And let's save this, and let's come back over here and see what it looks like. All right, doesn't look like I had any big errors in there. And this should kind of look familiar. This is our standard unstyled table that we wind up with when we haven't done a whole lot. It's the default kind of thing that you get from most web browsers. So here, Bootstrap does not do anything particularly surprising to this table. By default, there were a few things that it did to the page, but it doesn't make your tables look any better out of the box. But it can make them look better. Before, we had to go through and define all kinds of complicated things with the CSS. So we might do something like this, table, th, td, and then give it a border rule, 3px, let's say 3px, solid, and then I have my light gray that I really like. And then let's also do padding of 3px, that's one I always like. And then for just the table tag, we might want to do something like border collapse, collapse. Let's go ahead and save that. And now here I've got this CSS out in an external file. I need to make sure I link it in. When you're using style sheets along with a predefined framework like Bootstrap, they should be able to get along together as long as you include your styles after them. So that's what we'll do. Link rel equals style sheet. And then href is just going to equal the name of the file, example9.css. And then we close it out. And this should pull in that little bit of CSS I just created. Let's see what we get. There we go. Not too bad. So now I just got that basic styling on there. It certainly does some things for me. Let's see what Bootstrap has to offer. The first thing I'm going to do before I apply the Bootstrap stuff, I'm going to come over here and disable these. So I'm going to highlight the whole thing and then hit the command / to comment it out. Highly recommend doing that because every language has a different way of commenting, and this way you don't have to remember. Just use command / or control / on Windows to comment it out. Now let's come down here to the table itself and do this a little more Bootstrap-like. Bootstrap has a class, a very poorly named class called table. Now, table itself could be is a very common name that you might have used for other classes. So you always got to be careful when you're working with something like Bootstrap that you don't accidentally reuse one of the classes it created. So here we go. Table class equals table. Once I do this, I've told it, Bootstrap, I want you to style this as a table. Now, it really should have done that right away, but it doesn't make any assumptions until you tell it to do something. And now it takes control. It did a lot to this. Let's take a look. First of all, it now spaced things out to take up the full page width, and it will continue to do that. It has placed them in nice, neat columns with some good use of space here. The headers up at the top are no longer centered. Remember, the default for Bootstrap with headers, or for HTML with headers on a table, was to center them. It also created a thicker line below the heading row, the T head, and then thinner lines between each subsequent row. So it gives us some nice, modern-looking, very minimalistic kind of styling onto this. This is a great start. And all I had to do was put class equals table. I didn't have to do anything complex like this. Now, in fact, we can go further than that. The basic table styling does a lot of things for it, but you can then add other smaller sort of portions of table styling to this as you see fit. All you have to do is specify multiple classes. When we specify multiple classes, they're just separated by spaces. So I can then say table dash, and you'll see here what a lot of the different things are that it offers. First, we'll do my personal favorite, table striped. You can probably guess what this is going to look like. With this, it goes through and colors every other row with a slightly darker color. I always like this just because it makes everything a lot more readable. So table striped is a great way to go. Another one that it offers is table bordered. And this is going to put a border around the entire table and not just between subsequent elements. So it will complete the missing borders that aren't there. So you see it puts the vertical borders in, and it surrounds the whole table with a border too that wasn't there before. So this just gives you more delineation between things. Again, might make it easier to parse out the data. It all depends on what type of look you're going for. Now, one other thing to notice here, this is still fairly responsive, just like every container element is inside of Bootstrap. But something kind of goes wrong as we get smaller here. It starts to bump things onto multiple lines, and then eventually it'll start to shrink it. After a while, it sort of breaks down and isn't quite as useful anymore. Now, one of the other classes you'll notice that gets offered as we start to type table dash is table responsive. This one's actually a little different from the rest. It's meant to be a container that you put a table inside of, and then it will cause the table to behave a little bit differently. So let's go ahead and do that. I want to come in here and create a div, and I'm going to give this div the class table responsive. Now, how do I know to do this with it rather than to just add it into the list here? Well, you'd have to go read the documentation on that particular class, and I'll show you where you can look up stuff like that in a little bit. And then let's close out the div right here. So there we go. We've got our table in there along with the T head and the T body. Yes, we are closing the T body correctly. Yep. And then there's our div around the table. Somehow my indentation seems a little bit messed up. Oh yes, because this div isn't inside of H3, so it should be just like that. There we go. Now let's see what that does. So you already saw what it behaves like without that, and it's still going to behave like that most of the time, where it resizes to fill its space. But what this is going to change is when it gets small. When it gets so small that the table would start to move onto two lines, it's now going to stop making the table smaller, and instead it makes it scrollable. So you'll see here now, instead of having it be something that would get scrunched up, instead it just makes it so that I can scroll left and right to see the full width of it. So it keeps the table from getting excessively small, which is a fairly useful thing. So if you add a div with the class table responsive around the table object, you can get that. One last thing that I didn't cover that might be interesting is table hover. And what this does is it applies a style so that whenever you're hovering over a particular row, it highlights that entire row. So if we come back out here, you'll see, did we get it? And it looks like we didn't get it quite right. Why is it not doing that? Maybe I forgot to save here. Table hover and refresh. Oh, I probably need to get out of responsive. Let's turn that off. Just exit out of this. There we go. It wasn't doing it because I was in the touch mode. And so now here, as I go across a row, it highlights the entire row. You'll notice this conflicts a little bit with the table stripes. So very often you're either using table stripes or table hover, and not both. I'll take off table stripes so you can really see it. And there you go. It highlights the entire row whenever you hover over it. Again, all depending on which one seems to serve your purposes the best as to which one you might try and use. So this gets us a little bit closer to starting to see the essence of Bootstrap. By applying a few simple classes, we didn't really have to go over and edit the CSS heavily, or really at all. We include in this Bootstrap CSS, which is a whole bunch of predefined things for us, and then we make sure we use it correctly. We do still need to put things inside of a container, but as long as they're inside of that, we can apply things like page header, table responsive, and table, which are all predefined by Bootstrap, and get very beautiful results without a whole lot of work. That's the whole point behind this. We get to something that follows good design rules, that has good user experience built into it, and UX kind of thinking, without having to hire someone and really make it work. What's the downside to this? Well, obviously, you can tell a Bootstrap site when you see it. Now, Bootstrap does offer you the ability to theme the things that it does, but that gets much more complicated. We're not going to get into theming in our class. So you could take the generic Bootstrap look and feel and make it a little more customized to your experience at a later time. I'd encourage you to look into that if you'd like to become more sophisticated with your use of Bootstrap. For our purposes, we're just going to keep looking at some of the more user interface type elements that Bootstrap offers.